Thanks everybody for coming for the departmental seminar. The Hefner's pleased to be able to contribute to this with today's presentation. And of course, tonight will be the 48th annual Hefner Lecture, also with a completely different subject. Our speaker, Dr. Lowman, has already been through a lot of adventures today, speaking with many of the grad students, and of course, starting yesterday early morning to get here. So we're really thankful that she's here. Just want to give a brief introduction to who she is. Of course, most of you have probably seen at least the short CV that we circulated. But Dr. Lowman has training from Scotland's University of Aberdeen, Williams College, University of Sydney is where she did her PhD. She also worked at the Aldo Leopold Leadership Program at Stanford and the Tuck School of Business in Dartmouth. And so she is a very broad thinker and has very broad applications to her various activities in life. And in fact, she is really one of those people whose influence sort of, at least for me, forms the background of our understanding of much of nature. In fact, as I was thinking about giving her a call to invite her to this, I just went back to some of my old collections of National Geographics and things like this, and just flipping through, I was like, oh yeah, there she is, there she is, there she is. And so in addition to Dr. Lowman's academic work, she's also been a museum person working at places like Arboreta, and in fact, the California Academy of Sciences, where she helped bring everybody's favorite app, at least in this department, iNaturalist, to its modern incarnation. So at the very least, we are thankful to her for that, because it provides us many assignments for our students in diverse classes. And over the last 40 years, Dr. Lowman has worked in 46 countries, all seven continents, of course, including 25 consecutive years in the Amazon. She's authored over 150 scientific publications, including all of the major forest canopy books. And importantly, from the museum outreach standpoint, she's also authored 10 books for popular audiences. And in fact, she's got one that she referenced at the graduate student lunch that was obviously very impactful to a lot of people. Meg's personal mantra is "No child left indoors." She's a champion for inclusive field biology, creating initiatives that provide incomes to Indigenous people through things like ecotourism instead of logging. She has innovative partnerships with churches in Ethiopia to help preserve some of those unique forests. She's led hundreds of students and scientists on collaborative research in Malaysia. And according to the metrics I saw, interacted with over 10 million school-age children, which is hard to beat or even approach. So all in all, Dr. Lowman is an example of both a productive scientist and an effective science communicator, and someone that we can all strive to emulate in all aspects of our work. So with that, I turn the time over to Dr. Lowman.
All right. Oh my gosh. Well, thank you so much. What a pleasure to be here. I've had such a great time. Thanks to all your students asking really hard questions. And I promised them 45 slides of technical data. And you're just about a 3-hour lecture, you said? Quite the opposite. So anyway, raise your hand if you ever climbed a tree in your whole life. Oh my gosh, well, converted. All of you are taking after your ancestors, right? Those primates that were doing things long before we were. That's the one cool thing, I guess, about being a forest scientist, is at least a lot of kids like that. And how I reach 10 million kids is because I do things in trees, and then kids at least listen. I know that for some of you, if you work on DNA or microscopes, it's got to be a lot harder. So I give this talk as a mom more than I do as a scientist today, because what I promised the students I would do is try to say to myself, how do you synthesize your work? How do you make a broader impact? What are you doing when you publish papers and you try to get promoted and you try to do this and that? So I started a new project 2 years ago called Mission Green, where I thought to myself, you know what, instead of retiring, how do I synthesize all of this crazy work that I've done all my life and try to help my kids have a better planet? So that's what I want to share with you today, is one data slide, I promise, only one, and then a little bit more conversation about perhaps things that we all want to try to do, is how can we use our information to make the world a better place. And I'm not sure what'll happen. I can't go to the grave till I succeed at this, but I'm determined to try to make it happen. And so this is all a bit about taking the forest canopy, transposing it to becoming more economically as well as ecologically useful. And as Steve pointed out, I've worked in this business for over 40 years. I actually have over 200 publications now. It's so boring. Raise your hand if you read all of them, right? Just kidding. And, you know, all these different countries, which surprises me because I come from a very small town background and I only thought you could travel if you became a stewardess. So I thought I would maybe be a park ranger, but even that wasn't supposed to be for girls when I grew up. So it surprised me a lot to end up in tree science, where I actually went to a lot of different places. And the amazing thing even more is that when I first started studying trees, most everyone only studied the first 6 or 8 feet and not the whole tree. And if you read the prologue of my book, it says, I had made an analogy. It would be like going to the doctor who looked at your big toe and said, oh my gosh, your ears are healthy, your eyes are great, your brain is fine. And you never looked at any other part of your body except your big toe. You'd go, I think you'd change doctors, right? And yet we had this whole forestry world that looked at the trunk of a tree, kind of gazed up, and if they saw the canopy, it was usually after they cut the tree down. And quite frankly, the insects were squished, the birds had flown away. And so the perspective of a tree was probably very skewed in terms of our holistic knowledge. So when I was a naive graduate student who got a scholarship to the University of Sydney in the good old days, because they really wanted people to come from overseas, I couldn't believe it when I got to the rainforest, because I grew up in upstate New York. I couldn't see the top of the tree. I couldn't even see halfway up the tree. So I thought, oh my gosh, I wanted to study leaves. And I said to my advisor, could I get a hammock and just let them fall on me? And maybe I could train a monkey or something. And he's like, no, I think you need to get up in the canopy if you want to study the leaves. So that was kind of what happened. So here's my whole research career based on that first slingshot and harness and everything else. But I became very interested in this one basic question, which was, how long do leaves live in the tropics? Anybody know the answer? How many papers of mine did you really read? Anyone want to guess? How long do leaves live here in your backyard?
6 months.
Perfect. Go to the head of the class. Okay, now probably they live a little longer in the tropics, right? Because they're evergreen. So how long do you think they live in the tropics?
2 years.
That's what I thought. I thought the perfect PhD. I'll get out of this place in 2 years, no matter what. And boy, was I ever wrong. Guess what? 20 years. Some of my leaves stayed on the tree. I did get to graduate, thankfully, but I couldn't believe it. And those were those understory leaves of things like Doryphorus sassafras that are in a fairly windless, shaded environment. Now the sassafras leaves at the top of the tree lived about 3 years. So there was a huge range, but the fact that some lived that long just absolutely surprised me. But along the way, when I started studying leaves, guess what? Things started eating them. I hated that. I hated insects for the first 6 months of my research, because every time I numbered a leaf or made a sample out in the field of monitoring my leaves over time to see how long they lived, A, it either got 100% eaten when it was young, or B, it got quite a bit eaten when it was a little older than young. And I was like, oh, this is really awful that these insects are doing this to me. So then I was curious what ate the leaves, and one thing led to another. And then I got interested in counting insects. And so I started measuring frass. You all know what that is. I thought it was from your woo, but it's German for eating. And so it was pretty fun to study frass, except in the rainforest, it was harder to collect when it's so moist. But I also couldn't find the insects. They weren't there. I would climb every day and I would find all this damage. And lo and behold, one night in the middle of Dorrigo National Park, I got up at 2 a.m. to use the outhouse. Any of you ever have to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night? It happens, doesn't it? Especially when you're camping. And I got out there and I heard this amazing noise overhead. All these insects were destroying the canopies of sassafras and coachwood. And suddenly it's like hit you head over the science. I realized, why would the insects prefer to eat at night instead of, right, no predators? It was like I couldn't believe I had climbed trees for almost 2 years before I figured out that the insects like to feed at night. So then I got much better at finding the insects, and I didn't have to rely on the frass as much, but the insects would fall down, and then I got interested in nutrient cycling, and then other things happened. The leaves fall. I had to study the decay of the leaves and figure out what was going on in the whole canopy to forest floor ecosystem. And then I got interested in, why do some leaves fall when they're green? And so every time I turned around, there was a different question in my research. And I say this because a lot of you students are probably there right now, like, how do you keep focusing? And the answer is, maybe you don't. You get diffused in your brain like I did. And then you're interested in what happens with the rainfall. And then, of course, ultimately with droughts and climate change. So we get a little involved in other things. And then I got interested in mycorrhizae. I talked to some of you about that. And so lo and behold, suddenly this whole tree has this amazing composition. And then you have to multiply this by hundreds of species. And in the case of Australia, 24 rainforest types. And then in the case of the world, hundreds of rainforest types and thousands of species. And I don't have enough time in my life to do all that, but I find it really fascinating to try to figure out what are those seminal or keystone trees that I need to study. If I go to the Amazon, which trees will I pick to study? So it's been fun over time. And the big result of all this canopy work is this amazing hit you over the head result, just almost like insects feeding at night, is half of the biodiversity on land lives in the tops of trees. So here's this extraordinary, what I call the 8th continent in my book, because it's a new arena for discovery that none of us knew till the 1980s. And, scuba gear was invented in the 50s. Anybody remember that? I was just a baby, but maybe I, and, we went to the moon. When did we go to the moon? Yes, the 60s. The word astronaut became, a household word. Aquanauts were in the 1950s, but arbonauts, tree climbers like me, it didn't happen till the 1980s. So here's this thing in our own backyard that we never ever knew about until maybe about 40 years ago, when we started developing these crazy methods, in my case, slingshots and ropes and harnesses is the first opportunity. So that got me excited about the fact that this science could maybe be also a nice transition to working with lots of people. As I told some of you, I've been in the museum world on and off, and where you address K through gray, meaning kindergarten through senior citizens, you have a broader audience than when you're a professor. And so as a mom, of course, it really excited me that I could combine my parenting with going to my kids' schools and figuring out messages there to translate. And again, arbonauts have a pretty good opportunity for that. Every science does, but we have to think about our language, and we have to say, wait a minute, I can't talk about 25% herbivory and monitoring 2,400 leaves and Nothofagus moriae every month. I mean, kids are going to glaze over, but if you say, oh my God, these crazy wild looking beetles were eating up all the tree and I had to climb it and look for them, and they go, oh, that's exciting. So it was fun to try to rearrange my science to both suit parenting as well as maybe a broader audience. These are the kids. I don't know if I have a pointer. Oh yeah, from the Meg Lowman Treetops Camp in my hometown, which has a lot of underprivileged kids. She's one of my rock star climbers. These are 3rd graders from the Canopy Walkway in Sarasota, Florida, who discovered a new species of weevil eating the bromeliads. They're all in the scientific literature at age 11. So the secret here, students, is you don't need a PhD to be a published scientist. You only need to have your powers of observation, which is kind of cool. Other things that I learned along the way of this career in science and all this data collection is, trying to give more people an opportunity. That's something that particularly impacted me because I was excluded a lot as a woman in the field. I have a lot of funny stories in my book. They weren't so funny at the time, but I tried to make them funny about being the only woman on an expedition, or even worse, signing up as M. Lowman so that they wouldn't know my gender when I went on the expedition. So with all that, I got very interested in the fact that even in ecology, we thought we were being more inclusive, but we still managed to exclude a lot of people that had different kinds of disabilities. And in particular, in field biology, it's usually easy to exclude those people that don't have the ability to walk as well as we do. And they usually get relegated to the lab or the notebook or something. So I had NSF funding for 5 years to take mobility limited students and teach them to climb trees, which was fantastic. And they did all sorts of amazing things, including discover new species in the oak trees of Kansas, which was great. I think canopy research has really opened up our eyes about the value of trees. As I told some of the students earlier, I've lectured in business schools where they think a tree is something that adds to the real estate value of your home only, and nobody in that kind of training really gets educated about the science of trees to know that fresh water is cleansed through the canopy, or know the amount of oxygen produced, or really understand the nuances of sustainable timber, or that the roots keep the soil from floating into the ocean. Or definitely business people don't usually know that 50% of Earth's species live in the treetops, and that tree trunks store carbon, and et cetera, et cetera. So we have this amazing disparity in the knowledge. And so hopefully those of us that are involved in ecology or tree science need to communicate this message to those people that fortunately or unfortunately are clearing the forest because they think that is the only value of a tree. So all of these things along the way in my career were little sort of moments of eureka thinking that allowed me to say to myself, you know, what's important and what's not. And it actually became more important for me to talk at a business school than it did to talk to an Audubon society. I think you understand why that would be the case, because they're a converted audience versus trying your best to talk to the most disparate audience you can find. And I was dying to go to Mar-a-Lago and have Trump invite me for dinner. He lives right across my state, but he never did invite me because he needed me to tell him about trees. I know that. I also talk in my book, and this took me my whole lifetime to dare to write this chapter about the issues that were not so kind along the way. I call it the glass canopy instead of the glass ceiling because that's just my own little language. But you know, I had a lot of occasions where, as I mentioned, I wasn't really welcome in the room, and definitely times when we called it the tall poppy syndrome in Australia. But if you did as well as a male colleague, they wanted to axe you out of the picture. And so that was a very commonplace activity in my generation, hopefully not in your generation. So I always loved my favorite tree, the figs. I love the figs because they nurture the whole community. Lots of biodiversity lives there. They are the source of amazing medicines in India and Asia and Florida and South America and Australia. They are so global in their distribution. And secretly, they have this group of figs, you know, called the banyans or the strangler figs. And they strangle their host. And I sometimes lecture to women's groups and I say, if I'd been more strategic when I was younger to think about light and resources early on, you know, maybe I could have outcompeted with men. I don't intend you should strangle your male bosses, but you might want to think harder about how you deal with them. So that was always something that came up in my career. And the other thing I learned along the way that I think was the most important thing maybe was that the work, the effective forest conservation work I did was really based on building trust with local communities. They never asked for my CV when I visit the priests in Ethiopia or worked with the chiefs in the middle of Western Samoa in some island. They never wanted to see my publications, but they wanted a friendship. They wanted trust. They loved to see pictures of my children. It was almost as if for the first time in my career, being a female in these minority situations was actually an advantage. So capitalizing on that, I realized that it's because it's based on interpersonal relationships to succeed more than it is the metrics that I had been taught back at my universities, which were required for me to get a paycheck or be promoted, which kind of raises that ugly question, are we using the right metrics in universities to reward people when maybe the world itself is not really being rewarded by those metrics? So I leave you with that question, and go on to say that I started a little foundation in the year 2000. It's called Tree Foundation, treefoundation.org. And the reason I did that is because I had helped build the first canopy walkway in Australia in 1985, so that more people could see the canopy that might not be able to climb on a rope, so that it was safer, so we could sample the bugs at night easily, which was fantastic for my research. And when I came back to the States with my kids, they wanted a walkway in Williams College where I was a professor, so we did that. And then I moved to Florida as a botanical garden director, and Florida wanted a walkway. So to fund it, the Downtown Association and all sorts of great people worked with me, and they said, you need a foundation because you need the tax deductible ability for people to donate to it. So we started this little foundation just to build that walkway, but it taught me a lot because suddenly I had to make a business plan. I had to take a course at the Tuck Business School, as Stephen mentioned, and learn how to really operate a budget well, and how to get equipment and supplies out to a state park, how to get the permitting in the state park, et cetera, et cetera. And so with this little foundation, we ended up doing a lot of other projects. We did actually water supplies for villages in the Amazon. We had a sloth conservation program because of course kids love that. We had our little weevil watchers, the third graders. Every year after those kids discovered that, their brothers and sisters begged that teacher, we want to go out and watch the weevils. So we had this amazing long-term data set on the weevils in this amazing place in Mayaca State Park in Florida. We had the Treetops Camp in Elmira, New York, and we had, different projects that kind of over time. So now I'm just working with this foundation to say, how can we use canopy ecology to augment this problem that we all know exists? And that is, in my lifetime, 50% of the world's primary forests have been destroyed. Now, none of you know how old I am. I will never tell you, but I think some of you are my age. Some of you could be a little older, but it's just not a great track record. I'm so embarrassed by my field, my profession, where we work hard all the time and collect research and publish papers, that this is where we're at. And I almost feel sometimes like I'm studying in a forest, and behind me are the fires and the clearing and it's all going on. And then I come home and report it at a conference and everybody's happy and it's a great data set. Like nobody says, what's the fate of the forest, or how do you feel now that it's all gone? That just never seemed to happen until the last couple of years. And I think it makes me say, okay, how can I do better? What can I do in my world as an arbornaut to try to overcome this amazing challenge? And I don't think most timber getters or corporate operators are saying, I really want to screw my grandchildren. I think people just don't get it. I think part of the fault is ours from not communicating well enough. I'm not sure how we should communicate, but I think the world of science, when I was living in Australia in the 80s and working on these extraordinary droughts, killing all the trees, we said, oh, it's a 100-year drought. And then the insects came and ate all the trees. Guess what? In the geological community, they were talking about climate change, but we never knew it in the ecological community. Nobody mentioned the word climate change until the reefs had a dieback in 1997. And then suddenly the coral reef biologist said, holy cow, we've heard from the geophysicist about this climate change thing. And so even within our scientific world, I don't think we communicated well, and definitely we weren't sharing it with all the Australians at the time. So suddenly we are faced with this need for us to do better, but then the whole world to listen so they can do better too. And that was partly why I wrote this book, because the last chapter is about this Project Mission Green that I'm going to talk to you about right now. And tonight I'm going to go through the book and the climbing and the adventures and all the places I've been where women were not allowed. And hopefully it's humorous and not sad. I'm a mother of 2 boys, so guys, don't be nervous to come to the talk. And, you know, just this quick little chronology, so you'll see where this mission green comes into context. As I mentioned, it was really the 80s when we started climbing trees. I welded a slingshot at Sydney University shop out of a piece of metal in 1979 and borrowed a rope from the caving club and made a harness out of a piece of seatbelt webbing. And lo and behold, went up my first tree, scared to death, but it changed my life, obviously. I was working at an ecotourist lodge in Queensland, and they were so nervous about my training all these people to climb trees and getting students to help me. So we built this walkway there, which is fantastic. It's in a place called Lamington National Park. Anybody ever been there? South Queensland, if you get there, it's really cool. And then we went on to work with the Smithsonian and get the first construction crane. There's only about 10 of those in the world for canopy work. They're very expensive for most countries to afford. And so, but they're very cool if you want to get to every leaf within the arm of the crane. And I came back to the States and built the first walkway in North America as a Williams College professor, but this one was limited just to the students and faculty of the college, and worked with the French on these amazing inflatables to conduct expeditions in different forests. So that's the toolkit we have, and we're all discovering, we're publishing papers, we're getting promoted, we're so excited about the 8th continent, and that's fantastic. I built this walkway in Florida that opened up walkways to the public, which was fantastic. It really helped, you know, increase the number of people that came to see trees and got excited, and that was a really good thing, and founded this tree foundation so we could accept the donations to do that, and wrote the book, and then have come this far to now figure out that I need to do something. I need to synthesize all of those different projects that were great for science and great for some local places, but maybe weren't helping save the forests of the world. And you all know this, but you know, a lot of people don't know that forests are so important to us globally as well as locally. And no, most people don't know that planet Earth really needs its trees to survive. So this project, Mission Green, is I'm going to go to the grave with it. I'm looking forward to the earthworms eating me up because I'm getting tired, but I'm excited to succeed. It's a very doable project, which I will explain to you, to globally promote conservation, economic stewardship, and STEM education through partnerships of scientists, Indigenous people, students, and philanthropists, which I call Canopy Angels. This was based on the idea of a good friend of mine, a lady named Sylvia Earle. She's an oceanographer, and about 12 years ago, she started this project called Mission Blue, because she wanted to bring attention to all the endangered coral reefs or shrimp fishery areas in the mangroves and other places in the blue habitat that needed attention. Now, her project doesn't have an economic solution, but it has a great marketing arm that tries to persuade local people that they're sitting on a wonderful gold mine and they shouldn't overfish it and they shouldn't overexploit it. And now she has about 127 of these hoax spots, which is really fantastic. And she draws attention to them so that people feel honored to live near them and hopefully conserve them. I was pretty lucky to become a good friend of Ed Wilson while he was alive. We used to have fantastic lunches. And he was kind of a displaced arbornaut. He always regretted that he had never sampled ants in the treetops. He couldn't believe that he had missed this opportunity. So he gave me, you know, I think good bit of attention as a result of that, maybe living vicariously. And so in his book, Half Earth, some of you might have read it. It's a fabulous book if you haven't. He interviewed about 15 scientists, including myself, and said, what are the most important places that we need to save right away? And about a dozen of those are forest areas. And so that list in his book became the basis for Mission Green. And when I told him, I said, Ed, we can't save half the earth, because what if we save half that's destroyed? What if we save a quarter and it's all desert or ice? We need to earmark the highest biodiversity spots and save them first. You follow what I'm saying? So that we can keep the genetic library. It would be kind of like saying, let's save the Louvre and the Library of Congress if you're interested in books, but not my house and your house and your house, because we have some nice books, but we don't have the quintessential collection. So in his book, fortunately, is this list of what he thinks and what his colleagues think are the most important for us to save. So that gives us a really good scientific basis for these genetic libraries. And so the vision here is conserve these really important forests today. We can't take 20 years and we can't save all of Brazil, even though we'd love to, but it's just not feasible. And we've seen our government throw money at Brazil and have it become corrupted and not really effectively save the forest. So we need some other plan that maybe involves the local people a lot more than just going to the top government officials. We need to protect this biodiversity. And I believe we need to provide the local people with an economic opportunity that makes them the stewards of these sites. This is a little bit too much text. I would get scolded by all the Leopold Leadership Program, but the bottom line is I want you to just know that we want to build canopy walkways. We want to create stewards, local stewards as the ecotourist operators. We want to develop the best practices in education on these canopy walkways and train these locals in that stewardship. We want to create fellowships for students. These walkways are not just for ecotourism, but they're access. They're amazing access because kids don't have to make a slingshot out of a piece of metal anymore. They can actually use these walkways for new discoveries and make sure that it's self-sustaining, meaning when I walk away from building that walkway in Madagascar, it's going to pay for itself and people don't need to call me forevermore or get a grant or get some crazy, person to come in it for a lot of money to help them with it. So that's the sustainability piece, which is really, really important. And that's what's missing in Mission Blue right now. So with that, we have these elements of success for our business plan. We have a proven conservation model. I'm going to illustrate that in a minute with a couple walkways that already exist. I have a world-class group of experts on my board, and I will show you their names in a minute. We have enthusiastic students around the world that are wanting to use these walkways, and we can only do them in places where we have the local leadership and provide them with some type of income. So here's the 10 sites, drum roll. Just to walk through them a little bit, I'm so excited because Redwoods was one on Ed Wilson's list. That walkway, I did the fundraising talks for that about 5 years ago up in Northern California. They funded it and they have built it and it's open. So you can go there now and see Redwoods in a walkway, which is just fantastic. Mayaca River, the pilot walkway is completely open and funded, but we're going to get about maybe 10% more funding to do an ADA add-on for this walkway. And by ADA, I mean, we're going to develop activities that people in wheelchairs and strollers can do at the bottom. That will be VR, webcams, very cool signage and stuff that can even go back into classrooms as well. The Amazon, fantastic walkway. I'm going to show you pictures of these, completely funded and open, but COVID really took a hit on this place. So it needs a little bit of beefing up, and we're going to pilot our education programs down there because this is the site where I mentioned a couple of you. This is the longest canopy walkway in the world. Anybody ever been on it? It's called Axe out of Iquitos. And when I worked with Bob Ballard, I was so lucky. He started the world's first virtual education field trips for middle school kids with National Geographic, where we would go to a site. He took care of the marine sites. I took care of the rainforest sites, and we would broadcast back to schools. And this was in the day where we took a big satellite dish and it cost about $5 million a field site. So thank goodness National Geographic paid for it. But we went to this walkway, which was fantastic. And from that walkway, you said 10 million kids, 3 million kids worked with me for 2 weeks, on all the broadcasts. That was the total number that we broadcast to. But we also picked one Peruvian girl to be our ambassador. She was in 5th grade, Pamela Montero. So she was my student, sitting up with me, scared to death, measuring the weather, counting the bugs, etc. And she just finished her PhD at the University of Florida. I'm so happy to say, because I've been mentoring her ever since, and she got a scholarship. So she's going back to her indigenous village to be the trainer of all the local people, which is really great because that will help us pilot the education. Gorongosa in Mozambique, the Great Smoky Mountains. I was just working with the Cherokee Nation last week, who wants to build the walkway in their fantastic, beautiful forests. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park does not want a walkway. They said our staff is so overworked. We don't want one more thing that brings tourists to the Great Smoky Mountains. And, you know, understandably so. And but the Cherokees are like, we want to pay respect to our elders. We want our kids to see nature. So we want to build not one, but two walkways. One in the low and one in the high, so it's more than a dream, and they have all the casino money. And they have to spend it on community projects, so I don't have to fundraise for that one, so that's gonna be great. Western Ghats in India, similarly, the Indian people, contacts over there said, they said, we don't want one walkway, we have 1.2 billion people, we want 10 walkways, so we'll see what happens. Madagascar, our most urgent situation, 97% of their forests are gone. We have to build this one next year, so I'm fundraising for that one right now. We're $500,000 fundraised of the $1 million it'll cost to build it. As you can imagine, the supplies and shipping it are killing us for this one, but it is so critical. And to think that they've studied lemurs all these decades without any canopy access just blows my mind. And who knows what else is up in those forests. So it'll be really great if we can do that next year. And then eventually New Guinea, and we have completed a beautiful walkway in Malaysia that I'll illustrate to you in just a minute. So that's 10. Now, there's a lot of other places that want walkways. Vermont just got a walkway and I just went up and blessed it. Cleveland, Ohio, there's a walkway in the Arboretum. Oh gosh, we actually built it. I'm having a mental moment. Holden Arboretum, thank you. It's fantastic. It's really beautiful. And now we have other places wanting these walkways, which is really great, but we are going to fundraise and ensure these get built because they're all in forests that are critical for the biodiversity and the student research. And National Geographic has expressed a lot of interest in funding students for scholarships to do that, which is great. So with that local leadership again, totally essential. We might be able to do that. We want to prioritize families and women as employees, which will be really great with Pamela Montero starting this up. So, before I show you the pictures of the walkway, I just wanted to illustrate quickly. I promised a couple students a few pictures of Ethiopia. This is where I think I learned the value of this local trust. And some of you probably know, if you read the book, that I have been working in Ethiopia, and these are the last forests in the country which are surrounding the church. See the round building? That's a church. The Coptic or Ethiopian Orthodox Church is always round, and they believe, the priests, that they are, you know, the stewards of all of God's creatures. And guess what? I'm a conservation biologist. I believe that I should save biodiversity. I have the same mission as a priest in Ethiopia. So that's been kind of the source of our, you know, wonderful trust. And here is the chief priest out of Bahir Dar, Ethiopia. And so I go over, and initially he's like, what is this white woman doing here? Like, why would she come 10,000 miles just to help me save a few trees? But, you know, we've developed this amazing program of doing workshops for the priests and sharing with them Google Earth images, which they cannot believe. They've never seen such a thing, and sharing the value of the trees and helping them understand that. So they came up with the solution. They said, you know, what if we take the stones out of the farmer's fields? He'll love that. We build these walls around the church forests so the cattle can't get in and eat the seedlings. The people know the boundaries, and all the biodiversity is safe. It's not going to triple the size of the forest, but remember, it's going to hold that genetic library in place for the next opportunity to change things, which means right now they have such subsistence level agriculture. Until they can get a better crop yield, we can't expect them to reforest their crop areas. So that's kind of the story there, that in Ethiopia, all this local trust has led to doing this. We have 40 high biodiversity forests that have been selected by the one expert in forest conservation in Ethiopia, and we've walled 20, which has been at a cost of about $350,000. There's kilometers of wall, but it's cheap over there. But the amazing thing is my biggest fundraisers for this project, which has gone on for 10 years, are 5th and 6th graders who send their lunch money. They either look on my website or they hear a program that I give them on Zoom, and then they decide to make a school project and send a check for $150 or $200. But what it shows is the kids get it, you know, they really get the global importance of trees, where sometimes us adults don't get it and we ignore what's going on in the next county or the next state or the next country. So just quickly to show you this, I promised you this, you know, that we have these cases that are successful. This is the Florida walkway. It brings in $30 million in regional revenue, meaning hotels, restaurants, not just the state park. It has 500,000 visitors annually. So that's a fantastic track record over 20 years to say to ourselves, you know, we won't get 500,000 visitors in Madagascar, but what we will get is quality visitors, probably mostly bird watchers that will want to pay the top dollar to be in this situation. The Amazon walkway in Peru before COVID had 117 families employed, and those people themselves, not any Westerners coming in, said, wait a minute, we better increase the area of our reserve from 1,000 hectares to over 1 million. So that area now has a much bigger reserve, so they can keep the jaguars and the monkeys and the biodiversity that they now realize that tourists really want. My favorite wonderful example, and I'm so excited about this, just opened 2 years ago, but I got called by a corporate guy. That's what I love about this, who said, I'm writing a check for $3 million to build a walkway. Will you come and help me? I'm like, yes, sir, I will be right there. No fundraising. And this guy wanted to give back to his community. And so on the hillside over Penang, there is this fantastic canopy walkway, but they didn't have any science input. So my job was to give a science input. And so basically, I made a conference with the University SANS Malaysia, University of Science in Malaysia. So we had a partnership with the local biologists, which was fantastic, and they were excited. Secondly, I said we have to establish some kind of scientific resume for this site. And so he gave me $100,000. Again, I didn't have to write a grant to host a big BioBlitz using INET, of course. And so I was able to bring in 100 scientists and then partner them with local scientists. So we did this 10-day blitz on this site, got 1,500 observations of species, which was fantastic. It was so good that we then turned it into a UNESCO World Heritage nomination of this site. So now in perpetuity, it is a biological reserve forever and ever, which is really great because Penang has 2.5 million people and they all are so proud of this and they have a huge visitorship. So this is a fantastic opportunity because it's an economic model that's really working. They're in the black, they charge money, people come and visit it, they have bird groups, they have nature tours, they have this and that and the other, and it's working really well and everybody can see all these really amazing animals that live in the canopy of Malaysian rainforest. And then finally, to my surprise, you know, this Sequoia Zoo was so successful in its walkway. So basically, of those 10 sites that Ed Wilson had earmarked for me before he died, I have 4 done, which is really fantastic. And what's remaining and critical right now is to get this one done next year. And that is the field station for SUNY, State University of New York, Stony Brook research site. Maybe some of you have been there. That is a national park of fabulous biodiversity. And so that would be the site for that walkway. And the locals are beyond thrilled. Pat Wright is my partner in this project because she's been doing lemurs there for years. So she's the local trust element that allows me to walk in and do this walkway for her. I couldn't otherwise have worked in Madagascar without finding who that local partner is. And so that's what we have. I thought I had somewhere a group of the, maybe I don't. Okay, the The advisory group was Ed Wilson was our chair. Of course, he's deceased now. Peter Raven at Missouri, Pat Raven, his wife, Pat Wright, Wade Davis, who's an Amazon explorer and professor at UBC in Vancouver, Alamayu Wasiashete, who's my partner in Ethiopia, that's the only forest conservation biologist there. Sylvia Earle, the oceanographer. So we do have this really wonderful group of advisors that can say to me, this is crazy, or this is good. And I'm really honored and happy that we can get them to help us make this work. So next steps is to finish Madagascar, to create the education outreach using the Amazon as our focal point, to successfully train locals as guides. Now to start planning the Great Smoky Mountains, because these people are so keen. And again, I'm always so happy if someone has the funding that we don't have to take 2 years to fundraise, then it makes it more of a reality. So with that, hopefully we've spent and used, $3.5 million to date, and we are going to try to raise 10 million by 2030, and then this project will be finished. I will not have to go back to my donors like the Nature Conservancy, God bless them, or wildlife, and say, please send 3 times more next year because we need it. This will be done, and so that's kind of my little life, the rest of my life. And like I say, it's sort of like a hospital emergency room. We must focus on saving the areas that make the biggest global difference. Starting with 10 critical forests, we can reverse extinction and take giant steps towards a truly sustainable planet. Thank you very much. My mother still says, when are you going to get a real job?
You ever spent the night up in the thing?
Oh, I have. And I will talk more about that tonight, but yes, in that canopy raft in particular, and on walkways as well, mainly because I ended up having to look for those nocturnal herbivores. And every 5th grade kid immediately, the minute they hear that, asks, the obvious question, how did you go to the bathroom, Dr. Lowman? But at least it keeps them awake.
The walkways have research value because they're infrastructure's access. So can you talk about, you sort of didn't build in research as one of the main pillars. Just talk about how you see research fitting in and research funding.
Right. Huge, especially with the right partners, because the walkways, first and foremost, are to conserve the genetic biodiversity. Because by creating these areas where the locals have employment, we feel confident about the conservation of the area. The students and the research is the next layer, very important, mind you, but we do want to build the walkways and get the locals on board to save the forests. Now, fortunately, with partners like National Geographic, they really want the research. So I have a grant pending with them so that every walkway will have not just platforms, but research platforms, meaning we're going to fund black lights, weather stations, areas where you can sit and watch, and webcams, and all kinds of equipment to really beef up the research opportunity. I probably won't fundraise for those personally because it's a lot extra, but it's very fundable from NSF. Even the Rana Mafana research station could apply for an NSF infrastructure grant and get that. And then the other thing is Nat Geo is very interested because they have a lot of student explorers to, create a whole line, a stream of the first arbonauts, because there aren't too many arbonaut explorers. So I feel also confident that we can recruit that kind of thing once we get this a little bit better marketed and publicized. But it's hugely important. And of course, it's the underpinning of doing good long-term work to conserve what's up there and know more about what's up there. Believe it or not, I got a National Geographic grant called an Impact Media Grant, which is a bottomless pit where they said, we're going to videotape and produce and promote the building of the walkways and the biodiversity discovered up there. And I'm like, but I don't have the grant to build the walkways. Well, don't worry about that. We're still gonna do this. So it gives me a little bit of optimism that maybe they're looking favorably upon the science part of the grant, which is, I don't call them ecotourism platforms. I do call them research platforms in this case of that potential funding. So I'm really excited about that, but I've also learned the hard way as a researcher, the locals don't like it. The biodiversity is really under threat. You know, we've got to get the locals on board with those ecotourism guides and training programs. Absolutely, first and foremost.
So you talked a little bit about building local trust, and this sort of works in with your answer to the last question. What are like the specific ways that you're doing that and giving the locals like their own ownership over that project?
Okay, so two things for building local trust. It's like different in every situation. In Ethiopia, I spend a lot of time praying. I eat stuff that I have no idea what it is. I drink the local hooch because they want me to. So, you know, you just have to be really outside of your comfort zone a little bit. But in other places, you know, I show pictures of my children, or I used to, now they're grown up, but you know, and they always enjoyed that. They were just ways like I said, they didn't want to see copies of my research papers, but they loved seeing the pictures of my kids climbing a tree with mom or something. So those kind of things were really helpful. So now these areas are all places where I have worked or someone on my advisory board has the local trust. In other words, we can't build when we don't have that. So, you know, it is not a problem for me to go to India where I was a Fulbright and I've taught half the, you know, canopy population of Indian scientists to climb trees. So we have that amazing network of trust people in different parts of the Western Ghats. And in Mozambique, we have the Gorongosa National Park, which has got the Ed Wilson Lab, and all of those staff are on board because we've worked. Greg Carr, who funded the research station, is going to fund the walkway, which is really great if we finally can get around to getting there and doing it. So it has to have that local trust. It doesn't necessarily need to be me, but it has to be someone who is willing to take some time and energy to work with us. We don't have anybody in New Guinea. I don't know how I'm going to get to New Guinea. I know it's important. Ed Wilson said it was important, but again, we won't have any success there until we can find who is that group or person or NGO that has created the local trust in New Guinea. Just to be honest, that one's a black box at this point in time. Hope that helps.
How did you develop that trust at Williams? Universities are famously worried about liability, legal liability in the states. So how did you make that happen at Williams?
It did take a little time. Do you know how I did that? I researched what else existed there, and they had the Mystic program, for example, and all the kids climbed the masts of these big sailing ships, which was equivalent to 4 stories high. They had dormitories without screens. They were 6 stories high. And all of a sudden I'm talking to the insurance people saying, like, are these covered? And they're like, sure thing. And so bingo, it was easy after we had these couple examples. And the other thing we did for Williams at the time was we had a ladder connecting to the access, so we could pull the ladder away. Now, you and I know that some limber football star could overcome that, but for the most part, 99% of the students saw that as, you know, off limits. When the big tall ladder wasn't there, they couldn't access the walkway, so it was always controlled that way. The funny thing is, when we got down to Florida in a state park, heaven forbid, that became an issue. Oh, how are we going to do this? It's never happened before in a state park. And literally it took me 2 years to permit the state park. Whereas when we went to Western Samoa to build, it took 2 hours. Drinking kava, right? It's an energetic drink that the chiefs, there were 16 chiefs, all drink when they're making decisions. But it took 2 years to get the supplies there. And in Miami, it took 2 years to permit, but it took 10 days to build the walkway because we had all the supplies. So, but now we have the precedents for a lot of other places. That's what made Holden easier, and that's what made Vermont easier.
Well, Miami's got a lot of natural areas, right? Adjacent to campus, and we have a student climbing club.
We're all set.
Seems, yeah.
We have to build trust with your president. Should we take him up a rope and rub him down?
Yeah, that's right up the road.
But yeah, you can have a great opportunity. It's all, the precedents are all there now, which is good. Yes.
I went to Western Carolina University for my undergrad. So I was wondering, they work pretty closely with the Cherokee Nation in the area. Have you been in contact with them?
Yeah, well, and actually Appalachian State, I was the director of Raleigh at the Science Museum, so
Yeah.
I had to make partnerships with all the Carolina.
Yes.
And so that helped me a lot to go know who to call, but if you have any specific names, I'd love to know.
Yeah, I can pass on. We also, Western Carolina has a lumber club where you will climb up poles with just spurs. So I'm sure they'd be really excited to get
That's
contact.
great.
It's
That's
like,
really
it's
great.
already kind of there. There's someone who
Yeah.
does biodiversity at Beverly Collins.
Mhm.
So I can pass on.
Okay, I'd love
Because
that.
they do work pretty
Yeah,
closely with the Cherokee.
They have ASU, which is Appalachian State, in this case, has a whole special scholarship program for Cherokee students, so they're all excited, but Western is closer. so it
Yes,
would be
very,
great.
very. close.
Good,
Yeah, so
okay.
I'll pass them information.
Okay, thanks.
We're talking about, I'm curious about actually building the walkways. I'm assuming you have a template blueprints
Right,
that
right.
can be slightly modified. Do you purchase 15 walkways worth of equipment at it
Oh,
so
right.
that you get a better price? Because
Yeah, I wish.
it's really.
I had the budget for that.
Well,
But actually, I don't personally build them, right? I kind of go in and do the biological assessment, but I have a team of people. I've worked with a couple of them for 30 years, building in different one at a time sites, but the group is called right now, and they've been amalgamated here and there, but the official group is called Signature Research out of Atlanta, Georgia, because you need the liability, you need the professional people that are used to ordering and shipping overseas and things that I would never have the time or the expertise to do. But what is amazing, I just spoke at the Arborist Conference in Idaho, and these guys were, some of them cried, and I say that not lightly, but I was like, they said, we never knew that our skill set could help save the planet. They were almost overcome. And I said, you know, if 4 or 5 of you would like to help volunteer in Madagascar, and then maybe after that in Mozambique, and I have 300 names. They couldn't believe that what they know could help the planet. They were blown away, and they're offering to volunteer, which was amazing to me. They're not, wealthy people, but I think they just really cared about knowing that their skill set was something pretty important. So now we have sort of a wonderful cornucopia of experts and possibilities, which is good.
Are the walkways a standard length? You have to
Oh,
have X
no.
amount of forest to ensure
Yeah.
that it's a.
Everything
legitimate
is
walkway or whatever.
all personal, and there's different ways to build, and in the temperate zone, we do through bolts because you can go through a tree, but we don't in the tropics because the trees are so big and the fungal attack potential could be great just in that little 2 minutes of drilling. But we usually do what we call necklaces around the tree, but they have to be raised away with rubber grommets so that it doesn't hurt the tree. And we like to use poles, but we like to use big trees. And again, depending on the height of the forest, you can use one or the other. And all those things are personalized in that sense. I call the building modular because we build a bridge, a platform, a bridge, a platform, and you can so there's a little bit of sense of a modularity there. There's a group in Vancouver that I think might be retired now that used to build aluminum walkways. Some of you might have seen the one in the Vancouver Botanical Garden and a couple other places, but I don't like the aluminum as much because it stands out and it doesn't look as much part of nature, and it makes a bit of noise sometimes, but it's also very modular. If you had like a recipe, like maybe some kind of forest that was totally simplified and you knew you wanted 10-foot long pieces, you could prefab that kind of thing better.
One thing that kind of talked on some of the different classes I've been in, but like with national parks and things like that, where the public is making sites more and more accessible for anyone to come, but with more people being able to go and visit these sites, that means more people are actually disturbing those sites in one sense or another, and things like trash or pollution, stuff from humans that we tend to bring with us. So I'm just wondering for your sites and these canopies, are anything like that, kind of like those challenges have been taken into consideration, or maybe it's still too young of a phase to feel the human?
No, I mean,
It's really
you know, the walkway in Australia was built in 1985, the one in Mayak is, you know, the year 2000, so it's very much a potential. A couple things, one is, say, in an area like the Amazon, we're sort of like, you know what, do we want 100 people a week to come there, or do we want the forest to be logged? So, as you can imagine, the difference in the damage is so different that you never would say, we don't want the people to come, because you put the forest at risk. In a place like the Great Smokies, the Cherokees are brilliant, because they want to build two walkways. They want one really public for their mental health patients from the hospital, for their school groups. We picked a site that's very accessible, and then they want one remote, because they recognize that the one close to the bigger public will have impact and needs a parking lot, needs trash cans and things like that. And in all my experience of working on a lot of walkways, from the research perspective, insects don't care, flowering trees don't care, moss and epiphytes don't care. The one population that I feel you have to be very cautious about studying would be small mammals, because they love to use the walkway. They love to run on it, and it's become their little highway, and it's great for the tourists. But it might mean you can't do a mammal population study as well. You might do a behavioral study, but if you count them, they might be being there because it's too much fun.
All right, well, thanks everybody for all your questions. Thank you to Dr. Lowman. And of course, we invite you all 7:30 tonight in Laws 100, which is a nice big pit passion, which has fit plenty of people, and then a reception afterwards.